On behalf of the Westchester Land Trust, I welcome you to today's lecture, The Great Estates of Northern Westchester and the Influence and Contribution to Conservation. This event is funded by the Jerome Levy Foundation, whose original donation was a major contributor towards the purchase of over 300 acres, known as the Leon Levy Preserve, the former Bell property. And we're grateful to Ms. Shelby White, who's here in the audience today, for her generosity in honor of her husband, Leon Levy. The former Bell property, one of the great estates that we'll hear about today, now belongs to the town of Lewisboro and is protected as open space forever for the public to enjoy for recreation and education. So we have to say thank you to all of you who worked so hard on the management plan to make this happen, and to all of you who will continue to work in the future to enjoy this preserve. Many of you were part of those collaborative management plans that outlined the vision for the preserve use. And I'm pleased to announce that plans for the creation of a 20-car parking lot with accommodations for horse trailers and buses are under review by the various permitting agencies and boards. And private funding for this parking will be from the Jerome Levy Foundation and the Lewisboro Land Trust. So I think we owe them a great deal of gratitude. And in addition, last fall, the ruins of the Black family home on the Leon Levy Preserve were exposed, and the invasive vines and debris was removed. This is just the beginning of planning for the restoration and potential educational components for the preserve. This work is also funded by the Jerome Levy Foundation. On Sunday, March 10th, from 1 to 3, the Lewisboro Land Trust is holding a guided hike of the preserve, led by the naturalist Jim Nordgren, who's also here. He's here on the front row somewhere. There he is. Who was instrumental in helping also with the purchase and planning for the preserve during the time that he was town supervisor. So more information about the hike is on flyers at the back of the room. If you're interested, please take one. Many details contribute to the history of a place, and it is these stories that we're going to hear soon. Today we're honored to have two renowned and accomplished writers sharing the stage. Both of these men are internationally acclaimed and local celebrities well known to many of you. Both declare that a love of this area and the richness of its history shaped their future. They are both wonderful storytellers. Our first presenter is Philip Kuhnhart, who we have asked to introduce our main speaker, Alex Shumatov. Philip Kuhnhart has spent the last 20 years exploring the lives and accomplishments of pivotal figures from American history. As an author and producer for PBS and other networks, he has helped create stirring historical documentaries about presidents and other figures who shaped our country's future, and then written companion books to accompany them. Currently, he chairs the NYU Division of Transformational Lives. Is that correct? Kuhnhart has authored several books on Abraham Lincoln, and he's considered a scholar on Lincoln and his impact on American history and policy. We're very lucky that he wasn't at the Oscars tonight and that he was to be here. So I would like to welcome Philip to the stage, who will then introduce Alex. Thank you.
Thank you, Candace. That was great. I want to help welcome you all here tonight. This is what a marvelous turnout for people who love this part of the world that we call home, and to celebrate this great property. I remember I was out there with many of you when the town was first considering acquiring the property. We had a hike through in a group, and we all shared such excitement about the potential of adding this to our open spaces. And so I want to thank Shelby White as well for her generosity in helping make this marvelous open space accessible. 70 years ago, 170 years ago, Henry David Thoreau already saw how important open space would be to a nation fast developing and losing its connection to unexploited places. Old-growth forests in its native Concord, Massachusetts were beginning to disappear to the axe, and hidden places he loved to ramble in were fast developing. His great love was for the hidden byways of Concord, canoeing along the Merrimack River in the spring flood, swimming in Walden Pond's superbly clear water, where sights of the lake bottom mingled with reflections of the tree-serrated sky, and what he called his daily saunterings, in which he just let his feet take him wherever they wanted to take him. In his masterpiece, Walden, he gave his own fanciful etymology of the word sauntering. He said it came from sant terre, meaning holy ground or sacred earth, as if walking through the world in a non-deliberative, open way connected one to something that lay at the core of life's meaning. When I was a boy growing up in nearby Chappaqua, I could literally walk the 3.5 miles from my home to the village, going through the woods the entire way, without seeing any houses, and crossing only one road. My friends and I might as well have been woodland elves. The problem is that all that land was private and developable, and since then, almost all of it has been built on. Except for a few wonderful parcels saved, the town is almost fully residential now. I knew Lake Wacabuck ever since I was about 12 and part of the Seven Bridges Field Club in Chappaqua. For its swim team, Wacabuck had a very effective home team advantage. It was competing in a lake against teams accustomed only to pools. So sights of darting fish and billowing weeds and beady-eyed snakes moving through dark waters gave other teams the heebie-jeebies and often contributed to a Wacabuck victory. But my team members and I were used to swimming in ponds. My best friend, Scott Gibson, and I had explored every puddle, large and small, in our town, I think. We loved nothing better in summertime than seeking out hidden ponds in the woods and splashing our way through every inch of them, down to their muddy bottoms. Sometimes we covered our bodies in mud and then climbed into trees to let it dry hard in the sun before leaping down into the waters for a pondy bath. Moving to Wacabuck as an adult and living near the lake by the same name was one of the most satisfying decisions of my life. And it also meant living near some other great places as well. Pound Ridge Reservation, where my wife Margie has been on the Friends board for more than 20 years now. Mountain Lakes Camp, with its wonderful cliffs and rocky promontories. North Salem, open lands with their Shire-like views. Blue Heron Lake with its network of islands and inlets, and its grove of creaking pines rising up out of a sweet-scented forest floor. I know that each of you here could name your own secret places where you regularly find deep refreshment and renewal. Once there were grand estates that by their very nature protected such places. As one by one they disappear, it has become essential to organize public understanding and protection of these important natural spaces. Our speaker tonight knows about such things better than most. He once served as resident naturalist and director of the Marsh Sanctuary in Mount Kisco. He's also had one of the most astonishing writing careers I've ever heard about. One that has taken him all over the world in investigating little-known incidents, and then writing trenchant and moving stories about them for major magazines, in books, and now in a rapidly expanding website of his writings. He was born in Mount Kisco in 1946 and grew up in Bedford, where he was a friend of my friend Loudon Wainwright III. A graduate of Rippewam, of St. Paul's School, and of Harvard College, the last of which graduated him magna cum laude. He became a published magazine writer in 1971 and brought out his first book 3 years later, a reflection on his rambles through rural Florida. That project established his abiding interest in in-depth, quirky portraits of fascinating places. After a second book titled The River's Amazon, which grew out of a 9-month visit to Amazonian Brazil, and a third book on Brasilia titled Capital of Hope, he went on to write his most locally famous work, Westchester, A Portrait of a County. I first read it and loved it just a few years after it was published. When newly married, I moved back to my native county in 1984. The book's success led to a notable career as a staff writer at The New Yorker, to which he later added the position of contributing editor to Vanity Fair, and then to several, numerous, in fact, other leading magazines. Since 2001, he has broken out on his own, it seems. He's now a kind of writer, investigator, philosopher at large, following his penchant for long-length essays and underreported subjects of global significance. His specialties include environmental stories and human rights subjects. And he feels to me like a man on a mission. Over his lifetime, he's written more than 100 published articles, a total of 10 books, including the highly praised Legends of the American Desert. He is an iconoclast, a raconteur, a trailblazer, and a global citizen. And like Thoreau, a saunterer on the earth. It is with some awe that I introduce to you our speaker of the evening. We are lucky he agreed to turn his formidable talent on the subject of the great estates and of land conservation in Westchester County. So please join me in welcoming Alex Shumatoff.
Well, here we are. This, I promise you, well, wait a minute, I won't promise anything. I've been asked, here we go, let's go. I'm going to read it. I'm delighted to have been invited back this year to talk about a fascinating topic, the great estates of northern Westchester and their contribution to conservation. Before I start, I want to, first of all, can you all hear me okay? Yes. Okay. I want to apologize for writing my talk out and reading it like I did last time 2 years ago at the Bedford Historical Hall. Those of you who know me know that I have a tendency to digress, and this talk is going to be long as it is. My talk 2 years ago at Bedford Historical Hall, which I also wrote out and read, went for an hour and a half, and this one I haven't timed it, could be even longer. So in the interest of getting you out of here by 8:30 so you can watch the Oscars, if that's what you're planning to do with the rest of your day, the loss of a little eye contact and spontaneity seems a fair trade-off. But actually, I've actually done a little research on this, and I think I can do this in an hour. So. Secondly, I'm a Bedford boy, and I haven't even been that for 30 years, and I don't think I've been up to the Salems more than a few times. since I used to drive up to see Howland Adams in the early 70s. Howland Adams, you know Howland? Senior. Howland lived on Route 35, the old post road, a couple of miles up from Cross River. He was one of the last of the old Yankee subsistence farmers in Westchester and was living on and working on the same 100 acres that had been in his family since the Revolution. The Salems were still considerably more countrified than Bedford in those days, and they still are. I was in the spirit of the 60s trying to make it as a singer-songwriter and to emulate Loudon Wainwright III, who grew up across the street. By the way, if you've ever heard an incredible song he wrote about the Mount Kisco Hospital called That Hospital, you can get it on YouTube. It's really moving. You can get through that song without you're listening to it without your eyes watering. You know, you can get in touch with me and I'll give you a prize or something. Anyway, he grew up across the street, and I was trying to make it as a singer-songwriter and doing occasional tree work for my mother's friends in Bedford with an old McCullough clunker chainsaw that kept acting up, and I'd take it up to Howland, and he'd get it fired up and running smooth again in no time with a few turns of a screwdriver. Every time I went to see him, he'd have a new joke. One time it was, and he had this deep, gruff voice, hey Alex, how come mice have such small balls? I don't know, Helen. He said, well, because only 10% of them can dance. I hear jokes like that. After Howard died, his son sold the farm because he couldn't afford the taxes and moved to the Catskills. I don't think there's anybody like Howland in Westchester anymore, but we've still got quite a few of them up in the Adirondacks, in the mountain valley where we have a camp. One of them said to me the other day in the same gruff voice, well, Alex, you live until you die, and that's the only thing you do. Probably anybody in this room knows more about Lewisboro than I do, so I want to apologize ahead of time for any errors I am certain to commit and would appreciate being straightened out so I can put the corrections into the text of this talk that I'll be posting on my website, dispatchesfromthevanishingworld.com, as I did with my talk 2 years ago. I extensively picked the brain of my brother Nick, who spent 20 years curating the Nature Museum in the Ward Poundridge Reservation and has an almost mystical sense of this many-layered locale. He should really be giving this talk, but he's living as a recluse in the Catskills and is off the lecture circuit. His beat-up old pickup can barely make it into town. Just to give you an idea of the depth of his local knowledge, when I told him I was giving this talk at the Walkabuck Country Club, he told me that the carcass of Bet, the elephant of Barnum and Bailey's circus, lies at the bottom of the deep glacial Lake Walkabuck. How many people knew that? Bailey was a local farmer who became partners with P.T. Barnum, a professional showman and scam artist credited with coining the aphorism, there's a sucker born every minute. And Bet died at Bailey's place in Somers, which later became and still is the Elephant Hotel, and was brought over to Lake Walkabuck on a huge sledge, and a hole was cut in the ice into which Bet was dropped, never to be seen again. I'm also, that's a project for some local diver. It's probably very well preserved. There was some body of a woman, when I wrote about the Adirondacks in Lake Placid, who had been disappeared for several decades, and she was perfectly preserved, but very brittle. In fact, when they tried to bring her up, her head came off. The reason I've been asked to give this talk undoubtedly has to do with the fact that my 1978 book, Westchester Portrait of the County, has a chapter called The Days of the Big Houses, which is primarily about the great estates of Bedford. When I was growing up in Bedford in the 50s and lived there in the 70s, I frequented quite a few of them. Bedford was where most of them were. Some of them, with their stately Georgian brick mansions and rolling meadows and lush woodlands laced with riding trails, were a lot like, and in fact modeled after, the hereditary estates of the English aristocracy. The home of Robert and Margaret Patterson, for instance, which was designed by the firm of Delano and Aldrich and built over 1905 and 1906, had the only grass tennis court for miles around, as well as a flock of peacocks. And whenever a ball that wasn't hit high enough smacked into the tape of the net, the peacocks would send up a squawk that could be heard down in the valley below. Margaret had grown up in the house. She was the daughter of William Sloan, the department store magnate who built it, and the Pattersons left it to the county. It's now the Aaron Copeland Retreat for Composers. Copeland's son lives there, and it apparently needs some serious TLC. The people who lived in these houses were locally referred to as hilltoppers, although not all of the great houses were on hilltops. Some in this upper crust stratum were highly cultivated, like the Marquands, who frequently had Edith Wharton as a house guest, or the Bechtels, who were close friends of the poet Wallace Stevens, and had a beautiful rose garden, including a maze that we used to run around in as kids. Bennett Cerf, who started Random House, lived in Mount Kisco and had people like Frank Sinatra out for the weekend. And on Guard Hill Road was Crowfields, the large, welcoming country house of Cass Canfield, who was the editor-in-chief of Harper and Row, for whom I wrote my first book. Now it's HarperCollins. And further up Guard Hill, his sister-in-laws, the Cowards, had an even bigger chateau, and they had a publishing company called Coward, McCann, and Gehegan, for whom I wrote my second, fourth, and fifth books, including the Westchester book, shortly after which the firm went belly up, probably due to the poor sales of my titles. On Mianus River Road and its arteries, there was a colony of Hollywood and Broadway show moguls, Selznicks, Myers, Mankiewicz. In fact, I'm staying at the old Selznick place, inhabited for the last few decades by John and Francie Train. Last night they had a dinner that included Phil and Margie Cunard, Ptolemy Tompkins, who has ghost-written the current, he's the son of the Peter Tompkins, who wrote The Secret Life of Plants. Remember that book? It was sort of a great book in the 70s it was published. Peter Canby was there, the head of the New Yorker's checking department, who's married to Annie Putnam of Bedford, and he's checked quite a few of my pieces back in the day, including my Westchester piece. So there are still vestiges of culture in this neck of the woods. Both Mr. Goldman and Mr. Sachs had big houses on lots of land in Bedford. My dad played tennis with both of them on private courts, Jews not being allowed to join the Bedford Golf and Tennis Club. Helen Clay Frick the reclusive maiden daughter of the Pittsburgh steel baron and art collector Henry Clay Frick lived in austere simplicity on her 1,000-acre Westmoreland farms, half of which she gave as a sanctuary which my dad was the first president of. Many of the women on these estates were serious gardeners, and it was in Bedford that the first chapter of the Garden Club of America was established in 1938, as well as, more than a century ago, the first chapter of the National Audubon Society, which my dad and brother were president of, and I was secretary of in the 70s when I was the resident naturalist at the Marsh Sanctuary, which had a fantastic garden with a Greek amphitheater that Isadora Duncan had danced in. The chairman of the board of the Audubon Society at the time, Tom Cassee, lived nearby and was on the board of the Marsh Sanctuary, and Pat, his widow, who went to the Caucasus Mountains of Georgia with my parents to photograph their spectacular alpine floras, came to my talk 2 years ago. I don't know if she's here today, but great woman. Great conservation lady, great family. Bedford is also where the Nature Conservancy, which is now conserving wildlands all over the world, started with the acquisition of Mianus River Gorge and its magnificent virgin hemlocks. These hilltoppers loved their land and had the sense of service, stewardship, noblesse oblige, and the conservation ethos that were part and parcel of being a gentleman. The American conservation movement owes a lot to them, and you can't step into the woods around here without soon finding a winged euonymus, some pachysandra, or one of the other many other plants that have escaped from their gardens and become part of the local ecology. Like the starling, which was introduced in Central Park in 1890 by Eugene Shefflin, a bourbon brewer, who thought it would be a great idea to bring all the birds mentioned in Shakespeare to America, and whose descendants live in one of Bedford's hilltop mansions. When I taught school at the Bedford Ripon School in the 70s, I had one of my students was his great-great-grandson. And he was a fifth grader, and I made him write a report on the disastrous success of starling in North America. And the New York State Police was started in 1917 by two ladies, one of them a hilltopper, after some bank robbers in Mount Kisco shot a random customer dead and got away with the money and were never caught because Westchester didn't have a police force. Now, if you look at a map of the protected areas of Westchester, that I was doing just yesterday, there are dozens of them. And one of them, and many of these were former estates whose owners gave them to their community. And one of them I notice, you probably know this, is the Mommsen Preserve in Cross River. You ever heard of that one? It's so you don't even know about that. Mrs. Mommsen was this great lady. When I came back from the Amazon, as Philip was saying, I came up with a beautiful Brazilian bride. And we lived in Petona. And somehow we heard about Mrs. Mommsen, who was this wonderful lady then in her 80s who had grown up in Brazil. She was American, and her husband was a very successful businessman and the American consul of Sao Paulo. And so we would go over to see Mrs. Mommsen, and somehow she had no connection to the area, but she decided to end her life in America and somehow got this beautiful place. I think it was 40 acres or something, maybe 80 acres in Cross River. And she was kind of lonely. She didn't know anybody, and my wife was lonely, and we all just loved to go over there and talk Portuguese. And we had a wonderful time. And now I see that she left that property to Cross River. and it's really nice. So you know, you should go over there. Anyway, the heyday of Westchester's great houses and estates was from 1880 to 1940. Although in 1966 I whiled away an afternoon at Haywire, the agent Leland Hayward's place in Yorktown Heights, playing Scrabble with his ravishing red-haired socialite wife Pamela, who had been married to Randolph Churchill and would end her days as the wife of Averell Harriman. A new crowd had moved into these mansions or built new ones when I did a story for Vanity Fair about the demographic turnover of Bedford in 1999. Ivan Boesky, Carl Icahn, Nelson Peltz, Donald Trump, George Soros, Ralph Lauren, Martha Stewart, some of the biggest mega-bucksters in the country were among the new hilltoppers. A lot of these houses had stories. When James Sutton and his wife, the only daughter of R.H. Macy, opened the front door of their just-built house on Guard Hill Road in the 1880s, they were greeted by the sight of the architect hanging by his neck in the stairwell, who was apparently not happy with his creation. The mother of one upper-class Bedford family I knew in the 70s was a big horse rider. She had a bad fall that put her permanently in a wheelchair, and the family sold their estate, more of an estate-let or an estate-et, being only a dozen acres, and moved to Santa Barbara. The next owner was a member of the mafia. The estate abutted a nature sanctuary. I'm not going into a lot of specific details. And birds were flying into the surveillance cameras he set up and being electrocuted. Finally, a delegation of distressed bird watchers led by the formidable Georgina Cortland Van Rensselaer, one of Bedford's grand dames, who was actually as nice as could be and totally unhoity-toity, went to see the mafia guy. They knocked on his door, and he came out with a big piece in a shoulder holster under his armpit. Mrs. Van Rensselaer, unintimidated and trembling with outrage, told him, "You've killed all the goldfinches." And he said, "Lady, I didn't whack the goldfinches. I was in Miami Beach." That gives you a little idea of the You can read that story. I'll put it up on my website tonight. A lot of good stories from it. Anyway, the history of the 370-acre Leon Levy Preserve. Actually, I've seen it go up as many as 383. Do we know? 383? Okay. On the occasion of the opening of whose parking lot I have been asked to give this talk is really interesting. I've done a little digging, but already I can see that all the layers of human history in this part of the world up to the last 50 years are represented. And the preserve could be a fantastic field research laboratory for archaeologists, historians, and natural historians. You could spend years peeling away the layers and not begin to scratch the surface. An important Indian trail went right through the ravine in the preserve with its 20-foot high cliffs, and it would be surprising if there were not some artifacts in there. There's a definite Indian cave, its roof blackened by the smoke of ancient fires right across the street. Most of the natives who moved through the ravine were probably Kitchewonk, a band of Lenape, Delaware that summered on the Hudson at the mouth of the Croton River and may have wintered on Lake Kitchewan although the only artifacts found there have been archaic, much older than the late Woodlands Kichewunk. They belonged to the Wappinger Confederation and spoke the Munsee dialect. To the south in Bedford were the Tankatiki. These are the people who gave Chappaqua, Katona, Lake Mayapack, Mount Kisco, and this lake and country club their names. In 1644, 200 mercenaries led by the infamous Indian killer Colonel John Underwood were hired by the governor of New Amsterdam to avenge some attacks on colonist settlements to the south. They crept up on a winter celebration the Tankatiki were having, probably on the grounds of what is now Pepsi Beverages corporate offices across the Muscoot Reservoir in Katona, not in Cross River, my brother contends, and cut down 180 of them and set fire to 500 who had fled into their lodges. They burned to death without uttering a sound, not even the children. Not a cry or a whimper was to be heard, according to one of the mercenaries who was haunted by the pride and dignity of the way they went for the rest of his life. The rest of Westchester's native people were deported to a series of reservations in Wisconsin and Oklahoma's Indian Territory, where my brother tracked down the last 12 of their descendants who still spoke Munsee in 1985. My brother had found arrowheads and beadwork in caves in Bedford when he was a boy, and now that he was at the Nature Museum at the Pound Ridge Reservation, he became really interested in Westchester's long-gone original inhabitants and taught himself Munsee and the plants they ate and used for their medicine and everything about their culture that he could find out. I'd go over to his place and he'd serve me a meal of acorns and Jerusalem artichoke with tea of sumac berries or hemlock needles. The conifer, not the herd, which is poisonous. Talking about the tree, right? That's the one that killed Socrates, or related. The Lenape in Oklahoma were so blown away by Nick's knowledge of their culture that they made him a member of their Cheney River Band and gave him a Munsee name, which means he who stands firm, which he has used ever since. It was even on his driver's license until Homeland Security made it back. My brother found a magnificent bear petroglyph on a granite boulder right in someone's backyard in Cross River and started opening kids' and adults' eyes to what was really going on around here. It wasn't just bland, boring, generic verbs. It was a world of endless fascination and layers waiting to be peeled. Eventually, he got a grant to bring the 12 Munsee speakers back to their homeland, which their ancestors had been deported from 200 years earlier. And did any of you go to that at the reservation? And he had a healing ceremony at his museum on the reservation conducted by their shaman, a noble and powerful woman named Nora Thompson Dean. It was a deeply moving event for all of us who were there. This is the richest temperate deciduous hardwood forest on Earth, with 4,500 species of higher plants from ferns on up, and the natives made use of a lot of them. Not only a botanical, but an ethnobotanical inventory should perhaps be made of the Leon Levy Preserve, making use of the extensive library at the Delaware Information Center that my brother set up at the Nature Museum in Cross River. And I think I may have mentioned 2 years ago that my brother was also an artist, and he made this huge mandala And on the outer circle of the mandala were all of the natural dates, you know, when a certain flower bloomed, when certain berries came to fruit, when birds came. And then the next circle was the Indian seasonal cycle. It was very closely correlated, of course, to the natural cycle. And then the next one was the farmer. The farmers, and they still were on a seasonal cycle, but, you know, less interface with the naturals, but, you know, the seasonal thing. And then finally in the middle was suburban man who, like, you know, mows his lawn, shovels snow and rakes the leaves, and maybe has a garden, and that's about it. So that was very interesting. I think that might be over at the museum. Sort of opened my eyes. Anyway, back to the preserve. Several rare endemics, purple milkweed and blue cohosh, have already been reported on the Leon Levy Preserve, and there are undoubtedly more. I did an inventory of the Marsh Sanctuary's flora, and we found all kinds of surprising things, including a vine, Dioscorea violacea, which had never been found in Westchester. The Marsh Sanctuary was one of the last remaining habitats of the endangered Muhlenberg turtle, a fact which weighed heavily in the battle over the route of 684 up through Bedford in the 60s. In fact, that played a role in it going where it did, and not through the Marsh Sanctuary. You probably have some rare species here too on the preserve. New species of butterflies and mushrooms, subspecies, sorry, of butterflies and mushrooms at the very least, like I've discovered on our 40 acres in the Adirondacks. During the Dutch colonial period, the preserve was part of Van Cortlandt Manor, a vast estate granted to the poltroon ancestor of Georgina Cortlandt van Rensselaer, who had the conversation with the mafia guy. After the English conquered New Amsterdam, it was part of a section of land called the Oblong that both New York and Connecticut claimed. It had a no man's land frontier quality right up to the beginning of the 20th century. Cowboys, banditti, and rowdies, as described in a contemporary account, raided horses and cattle and stole things in Connecticut and sold them over in New York and vice versa. Vista, through the 1950s, had a pocket of rednecks and hillbillies descended from it. From the late 1600s on, settlers from England moved up to the Salems and eked out a hard-scrabble living from the soil, stacking the many glacial boulders into stone walls. Indians were still part of the local mix through the 1730s. The reserve has the remains of an old dam and mill from this period, during which its lower parts were flooded. During the Revolution, Colonel Shelton and his dragoons camped on the property for a couple of days. Major Andre, the British spy, was briefly imprisoned in Salem, and the last Wappinger sachem who fought with the freedom fighters was killed in the Bronx. And this is my brother told me this other thing. Colonel Rochambeau and his troops in the all-white uniforms of the French marched right up 123 from Vista, right past the preserve. When the War of Independence was over, Jeremiah Keeler returned to Salem as a hero with a sword from Lafayette. He built the White House on the corner of Route 35 and 123 in 1795 from materials from an Episcopalian church that stood across the street and was buried in 1853 in its graveyard. His son Thaddeus Hoyt Keeler, was the next occupant of the property until his death in 1874. Now, it's very possible that this this character called the Leatherman. I don't know if you heard about him, but he may have knocked on the Keeler's door, pointing to his mouth. He never spoke. He was, which meant that he was asking for if they could give him a meal. He was, I recall, he was a Frenchman. He was a bit attached to whatever you want to. His mind wasn't all there. And he had been, worked in a shoe factory in France and had been engaged to marry the owner of the factory, but then there was a fire and the whole place burned down and he was blamed for it. And the fiancé, the fiancé were canceled and he came over here and just wandered around for 300 miles. He had this 300-mile circuit, and it was such a local sensation that postcards of him were sold in the general stores. My brother thinks he represented an alternative lifestyle to the stifling, puritanical dawn-to-dusk routine of the local farmers, of freedom to roam that they didn't have. One of his caves is just above Kimberly Bridge in the Pound Ridge Reservation, and right next to it there's a bobcat den, or there was when my mom and I locked eyes with one of these magnificent super alert cats in the late 70s. On April 4, 2005, the Lewisboro Land Trust, a chapter of Westchester Land Trust, issued a press release that the 383-acre property had been acquired for $8.3 million and was going to be set aside as a nature sanctuary called the Leon Levy Preserve. Leon, described by Forbes magazine as a Wall Street investment genius and prolific philanthropist, had died 2 years earlier at the age of 78. He had started mutual funds that managed $120 billion and a hedge fund worth $3 billion, and his net worth was estimated around $1 billion. It would have been more if he and his wife, Shelby White, hadn't given so much of it away, some $200 million over the years. Among the many worthy institutions and causes, the couple donated a court to the Metropolitan Museum for the exhibition of Hellenic and Roman art, much of it from their own collection. They funded an excavation in Israel and a grant program for archaeologists to write up their excavation reports. They founded an economic institute at Bard College and endowed a $60,000 residency at New York University for biographers. Leon and Shelby founded the creation of native plant gardens in both the New York Botanical Garden and the Bahamas. As his brother recalled, Leon had a great love of nature ever since he planted his first radish at the age of 4. The year before he died, Levy published a memoir written with my esteemed colleague Eugene Linden called The Mind of Wall Street, a legendary financier on the perils of greed and the mysteries of the market. Linden is Time Magazine's longtime environmental correspondent and lives in Irvington, I think. If you Google Leon Levy, at the bottom of the page, the first page, you can refine your search to Leon Levy Biography Center, Cancer Center, Fellowship, Information Commons, Professorship, Leon Levy and Shelby White Court Library of Dental Medicine. So Leon was, in short, an enlightened human being, someone who had tremendous energy, many interests, and who cared about the world. I wish I'd known him, but his widow, Shelby White, is here today, and I've just met her, and I just want to thank you for this. I think if I had to do it over again, maybe I would try to make as much money as I could so I could buy and preserve land. That is the most direct contribution that you could possibly make to the world. Right? Anyway, it was Shelby's idea to set aside the preserve in his name. She and Leon had bought a place in South Salem to which she still comes on weekends, and she's a serious gardener. Her daffodils are reportedly among the most vibrant in northern Westchester. $5 million for the preserve came from the Jerome Levy Foundation, which Leon started in the 1950s in memory of his father. The town of Lewisboro put in $1 million. The New York City Department of Environmental Conservation another $1 million, in return for which the town gave it a conservation easement for the 90 acres that are in the Croton watershed. And the Dextra Baldwin McGonigal Foundation gave $500,000. Any other questions or anything? All right.
Thank you very much.
You're watching Lewisboro Community Television, Channel 20.